Hey everyone, welcome back to Chat Cemetery. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Jeff Ewing and Drew Dietsch. We're talking all about the movie adaptation of The Mist. Thankfully not the TV show, which is an upcoming episode. But Jeff, Drew, how are you both doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me on.
I'm doing as well as one can after having to view the ending of The Mist, but yeah, I'm sure we will get to that, because if there's one thing that is the primary focus, I feel, when it comes to the discussion of this movie, it is the ending, and it deserves discussion, but I think there's a lot more to pick apart than just that.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like starting off with a quick little discussion about the cast and crew. Obviously, Frank Darabont is no stranger to King adaptations at this point, and I've been pleasantly surprised by all of the adaptations he's done as far as the feature-length films go. And when I got to this one, I had heard that the movie was better than the show because the show came out in 2017, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of when that discussion started up, because unlike the TV show, this actually uses the same character names, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen the TV show, so I can't speak to it. I can only speak to its seemingly overall consensus, which seems to be pretty negative. It didn't go past a season. But I do think it's important to remember that when this version of The Mist came out, it was not exactly greeted warmly. It wasn't like trashed or anything, but I have a feeling that this is a movie that needed like a decade to really sit with people, because it's a weird blend of kind of campy, goofy, directly influenced by kind of 50s monster movies, and some really dark subject matter and social commentary.
Yeah, I also think, to kind of speak to the lack of comparable recognition at its time, I guess, it's kind of strange and interesting to me that, so it came out the year before Cloverfield, and Cloverfield is sort of widely recognized as prompting like a kind of a rebirth in at least the US of these large-scale monster movies of the same sort of genre. And The Mist has never been really part of that conversation, despite being just the year prior.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think The Mist is really, as far as an adaptation, it's a fairly simple story. It's mostly a single location, small cast of characters, and the film itself was made relatively on a low budget. I know Frank Darabont at the time was also, I believe, working on The Shield, and that he shot this primarily with a crew that he worked with on that television show. And that's certainly reflected in the film. I think the abundance of kind of handheld filmography, especially once we're in the supermarket for the majority, it's just a lot of, handheld kind of shaky cam, not, I think a clear stylistic choice, but there is definitely, to your point about something like Cloverfield feels like this appropriately really big scale event monster movie. And The Mist, while those elements are there, it's a far smaller story from both, I think, from a character perspective, and I think from the execution in the filmmaking. It feels smaller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like from taking place primarily in one like location to even closing off the world further with the presence of the mist. It doesn't have those big picture, giant entities among skyscrapers feel.
Right. What I love is that even though there's so many people in this, it feels like a really small town kind of story, because everyone is all up in everyone's business. And with this cast too, you have a lot of actors who have already been in other Stephen King adaptations or would go on to be in other Stephen King adaptations. Thomas Jane is in this, and what's the recent one he did? 1922, I think.
Yep. I mean, I have to say, I think if there's certainly, I think, a lot of debate around this movie as far as its quality. I would put forth that one of the elements of the movie that I think should be pretty universally recognized as good is the casting. I think this is an exceptionally well cast movie.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know. There's a lot of talent. The performers really do pull a lot of emotion and embody the characters really well. Like Laurie Holden really stands out to me. Excellent in the film. Thomas Jane did a great job. His son, also, I think for a child actor, was put in a pretty solid performance.
Oh, especially for what he's being asked to do. A lot of child actors are not being asked to carry that heavy of an emotional toll for the majority of a movie, and I think the kid does it very well. I think that the cast in a lot of places elevates the actual writing of the characters. Like, I'm not trying to say that the characters are written poorly. I think there are a couple characters that are fine. Like, they work, they function and everything. But then you get somebody like Toby Jones, and it's like immediately he makes the character of Ollie better. He kind of gives him a history just by the way he'll give facial, expressions in a scene. Like, it's just like, I feel like I learn a lot about this character, even though we really don't learn a lot about him over the course of the movie as far as who he was. I think that the casting of the movie might be its strongest asset.
I always love making those connections with who has been in other adaptations as well, because, Thomas Jane was actually in Dreamcatcher as well. Just a few years before this, you have Frances Sternhagen, who is always a pleasure to see. She was in Misery and The Golden Years. Andre Braugher was in Salem's Lot like 2 or 3 years before this. And of course, William Sadler. He's done so many things over the years, but he was in Shawshank and The Green Mile. So, this is a little different from the prison roles that he played previously. But I think that the casting, like you said, Drew, does really make a lot of these characters work. After I was done watching it, I put into Letterboxd that Marcia Gay Harden's Mrs. Carmody was the original Karen.
I mean, yeah, Mrs. Carmody, and I think even more so, Marcia Gay Harden is such a powerhouse in the movie to the point where I'm not averse to accepting a criticism that she towers over the movie at times, both as written and in her performance choices. But it is a wholly unforgettable villain in the Stephen King library of excellent villains.
Yes.
Yeah. From her sort of certainty in that she speaks for the divine effectively, and the fact that she clearly uses these external threats to solidify her own kind of psychotic power. It's a really, really she definitely becomes more menacing than the creatures they face in many instances.
Yeah, I mean, as a baseline read, this is one of those, the real monster was man all along kind of stories. But that's not, that's certainly something that runs through a lot of King's works. And I think the only issue I would take with Miss Carmody, Mother Carmody, is that the only scene that we get that attempts to humanize her when she's in the bathroom stall praying, it only adds to her villainy and there's never a moment where Mother Carmody seems like
a person.
Well, I mean, she's a person. I've seen those kind of people out in the world, but there's not even a facet of her that feels like, oh, okay, well, maybe I pity her, maybe there's some element in her past,
that the characters round it out in some way.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that she needs to be, especially for the kind of points that King and particularly Darabont's adaptation of King's work is trying to do with the character. But I think if there would have been even just a little moment that helped to maybe give her some context beyond the fact it's like she's, because the most context we get, I think, is Ollie, Toby Jones's character, saying like, if you're out of town, you should know she's known by all of us for being unstable. It's like, okay, I guess That's it. Like she's unstable, and we see that very clearly. But again, I think it's another case of Marcia Gay Harden. I wasn't thinking about that as much because her performance is so just it steals the movie for better and for worse, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I still think this was one of the adaptations that I liked a lot more than some of the other stuff I have talked about on this podcast. And I think part of the reason for that is the production value on this one and the kind of story that it is, because it is a monster story, but it ultimately ends up being about the people. And King is always really good at doing the character work in a lot of his stories, even when there are so many characters. You have, Melissa McBride, I believe it is, playing a mom who left her kids at home. And even in the small moments that we get with that character, it says volumes about her.
Yeah, I feel like you really see that with her character, and there's also a lot of the nuances of the different characters' performances, like the interaction with the stock boy in the back that leads to his demise. Not to spoil a character's fate, but fairly early on in the film, the interrelations between the sort of the people of the town really says in a small amount of time a lot about their characters, and that is one of the strengths I think of how they're written throughout this adaptation.
I would agree. I definitely don't want to take away from Darabont's adaptation, since he is the credited writer. I do think that it's extremely well paced. The interactions and introductions that we have to characters set them up really well, and they unfold exceptionally well as the movie goes on. But I really do think it is a case of, I could easily see this movie getting taken down a peg or two if this cast wasn't so on point. It's
Yeah.
Upon this rewatch, it's the thing that I think I've solidified the most about the movie is that I know this was a passion project of Darabont's for a long time, and I think that played into, if I get to do this and I'm only going to get one shot to do it, I need to pick the perfect actors for all these roles that could very easily be minor. Frances Sternhagen, for example. That is a role that I think you could have cast somebody else and it still would have worked and it would have been fine. But she makes every line delivery count and stick in your mind. I think that goes across the board pretty much with the casting. And you talk about it being a production. I will say this. The DVD and Blu-ray release had the black and white version of The Mist, which Frank Darabont has said he always wanted to do it in black and white, but knew a studio would never agree to it, but that he could just make it a special feature, essentially. And I had always watched the black and white version ever since I got it on home video. And this time I haven't seen the color version in probably over a decade, like pretty much since I saw it in the theater. So I watched the color version again, and I'm very, very set in my ways that I think the black and white version is superior for a number of reasons, but one of them being, on the production side of things, I think the creature design is awesome. It's so good, but this was a lower budget movie, and it's a 2007 film that has to rely on a lot of digital VFX for the monsters, and it just shows its age now. And thankfully, the black and white version helps those effects a lot.
Okay.
It really does. That's one thing that I noticed, because I originally saw the first one in theaters in color, and recently did a rewatch of the black and white version. And the only aspect, the main aspect of the film that didn't land as well for me over time was that the excellence of the design is kind of watered down, like you said, with it almost feels like, by today's standards, interim CGI, you know? But in black and white, though, you lose some of the messier parts of the CGI, but you retain the excellence of the design. And it makes it look a lot more like it was high quality practical effects or really good modern CGI more than it did.
Yeah, I think the black and white, for whatever particular reasons, it helps with layering. There's a couple shots with creatures where it's like that just looks like a digital effect layered on to a practical shot. There's no weight to this thing on, like, the specific shot is when one of the spider creatures is crawling on the hood of a car. And I was like, that doesn't look like it's on the hood of a car to me in the color version. But then I went and watched the same scene in the black and white. I'm like, for whatever reason, it works for me. And I will say, I don't want to totally down on the effects. There's a couple great shots. I love, probably my favorite creepy moment with the creatures is when the giant bugs are attracted to the front of the supermarket. The score by Mark Isham in that moment is so good, so creepy, and they have these wonderful close-up shots of the bugs crawling on the window, and you can see where their legs are making little imprints on the glass. I was like, that's the kind of touch, those little touches you need that you probably won't even notice you're noticing at times, that add that kind of weight to a digital effect. Because on a creature design level, I am shocked that this movie doesn't get talked about more for its incredible variety of monsters and the fantastic designs of them. I don't think there's a poorly designed creature in the entire movie.
No, there really isn't. There's a lot of detail in the face of those the massive spiders. Like, when you even get up close, you can see that they added detail down to, like, the individual hairs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really excellent adaptation of things that are, by definition, difficult to picture.
Yeah, since I had watched the show and then read the story and then watched the movie, I wasn't really sure what to expect on the production front and how the creatures would look. But even though I did only watch the color version, because this was my first time watching through the movie, and I actually don't know if the used DVD that I had the black and white version. It might have, but I opted for the color version just since I know that was how it was originally released. So maybe the black and white version is something I do down the line when, I don't have a million things to read and watch for this podcast.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, the black and white version as of now is not available anywhere on. I was trying to rent it. I was like, I'll pay the money, because my DVD's in storage. I was like, I'll pay $3.99 or whatever to watch the black and white version. It's not available anywhere to stream. It's not available anywhere to rent. Nope. And I really think that's a bummer, because in my opinion, part of the reappraisal of this movie is directly linked to the black and white version. And it very much seems to me that is the version that has been wholly embraced by fans of the film.
And it's kind of ironic, too, that it's so difficult to find, because it is the director's preferred version of the film.
Right.
It's part of the original vision, so you would think that would take precedence. And it's great that it's widely available on Blu-ray, but I do wish that it feels a little inappropriate that it's so hard to find it otherwise.
Especially now that a lot of streaming services are putting specifically director's cuts up. It's like you can't just, add the black and white version to rentals and purchases and things like that. So
sure, I mean they've done that with Mad Max Fury Road had the black and chrome version. I digitally purchased Logan, and it came with both the color and the Logan Noir black and white version.
Love that one as well.
Yeah, and then Parasite released a black and white version as well.
That's right, yes. It's always interesting to see that and to allow directors to do different things with their movies, as long as, the other versions remain available and accessible. But the fact that this one is becoming more and more, difficult to obtain digitally is, I think it's an issue, especially when I was looking up and trying to see. It's like, well, I know this movie's gone through some reappraisal, and I'd like to look up some opinions and stuff. And all across the board, everything I read was people being like, if you like this movie or you want to see the best version of this movie, the black and white is the way to go. I also think that the black and white helps with the tone of the movie. And this is something that I think I is a criticism I understand, if not wholly agree with, is that, like we said at the opening, this is a wackadoo creature feature that is directly, I believe Frank Darabont said that Stephen King referenced the Burt I. Gordon pictures of the 50s, which Burt I. Gordon made all these, like giant killer grasshopper movies and silly stuff like that. And that King drew specifically on that when he wrote the story, but he wanted to do a darker, more kind of contemplative take while using that as a background. The monster stuff in the movie, I can understand people thinking like, this is just wacky, especially with the effects and color.
Yeah, I will definitely have to seek out the black and white version for this because, like I said, I can't remember right now off the top of my head if the DVD I bought has it or if it was something that was added a little later after the initial DVD release. But in color, I still thought the production looked pretty good. Obviously, I've watched much older Stephen King adaptations than this one that definitely don't hold up as well. And even though you could see what the CGI was doing, so to speak, I wasn't like, oh my goodness, this is so bad, I need to turn it off. It just kind of added to this kind of movie, the budget, and I think it's something that people are a little more forgiving of because CGI has improved so much just from 2007 to now, or even, to the mid 2010s. And I think they did a nice job with the production given what they had for the budget. But do you guys have any other notes on production before we sort of dive a little deeper into the story?
Well, in regards to the production and your feelings about the CG not being distracting, I think that is a credit to the creature design. Because something that I really love about each creature that we meet is we see it and then we learn something new about it right after meeting it. The bugs that come in, it's like, oh, they're bugs, but then we learn that they have stingers. We see these spiders and it's like, ooh, they're scary. Well, they have webs, but then we find out that their webs also burn. These are such interestingly thought up creatures that even if the digital effects sometimes don't hold up, the way that they're being utilized is creative. So I think that speaks to that.
Totally. And just to kind of speak to that, I also love that they're clearly all designed as members of an ecosystem.
Yes.
Like there are food chains, like you have the scorpion flies buzzing around. You think this is the size of a small dog. I'm terrified. And then the buzzards come in or the giant spider entities. And you can see the interrelations of them and it's an entire ecosystem.
Right. It's not just an escalation and we see bigger and bigger and bigger creatures. That does happen. But we just see an escalation of these creatures. The tentacle comes in. It's like, ooh, it's a scary tentacle. But then it opens up and it turns out it can tear chunks of flesh off of you.
Mm-hmm. And like digest you
right,
just with a tentacle.
Or it has a wonderful moment where it like grabs a bag of feed or something and picks it up and crushes it. It's like, ooh, I feel the weight of this creature. I feel that there is an intelligence behind it of some sort. Mm-hmm. I think all of that is so expertly crafted that even if the digital effects in the color version don't hold up as much, I think it's all about how you use those effects to your advantage. And I think The Mist knocks it out of the park in that regard.
Exactly. And, to start diving into the story a little more, the reason they all end up at the grocery store is that this big storm is hit. There's damage to David's house and his neighbor Brent's car. And we immediately know that there is tension between David and Brent, which I think kind of amplifies the scenes in the store more because that's already been set up previously for us. And then you add in all of these other characters and you're kind of learning about all of the relations with everyone in this town, essentially. And the way they have that unfold, I think, works really well and just helps with, the cast amplifying these characters even more, like we were saying earlier.
Yeah, it does not take long for the titular Mist to show up and kick the premise into gear. But I think that when I rewatched this, I looked at the running time. I was like, oh, this movie's over 2 hours? I feel like I just believed in my brain that it was like, oh, this is like a 90-minute movie. That's how it always feels.
Because you don't feel the 2+ hour runtime at all, ever.
No.
Yeah, it really passes by very quickly in terms of just like our subjectivity, I guess.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is it sets itself up before the mist shows up. I want to say it does not take more than maybe 15, it's got to be less than 20 minutes before Jeffrey DeMunn is running into the grocery store. If it's more than that, I will be shocked, because that setup feels like it goes by very quickly. But this is why I think Darabont's a very good writer, and the casting helps a lot, is all of that setup, it feels very organic as to how these characters are relating to each other and the situation they find themselves in. And it just feels, like you said, it feels like a real small town. Like you get that vibe right off the bat. The actors are playing off each other well. They
have pre-existing antagonisms. They have
Right.
pre-existing reputations.
Sure. I mean, there's little things, even the William Sadler and his buddy, Jim and Myron, they immediately, the setup that they have about their anti-intellectualism and all of this, it comes through very, very clearly and very, very quickly while never feeling rushed. The movie feels like it's taking the exact amount of time it wants to.
I completely agree. And, Drew, you and I in particular have talked about certain King adaptations that, even though they weren't as long as this one, felt much longer than this one.
Oh, yeah.
And it just speaks to the kind of story that this is. Because if I'm not mistaken, The Mist is somewhere around 100 pages long, I want to say. So it's kind of creeping up to novella length. If it isn't, I know that's based on word count, and I have absolutely no idea what the word count of The Mist is, but
yeah, I think it's typically defined as a novella of Stephen King's. I know It's appeared in certain short story collections and stuff, but and I think in terms of story and adaptation of the story, I think this does a really good job of the paranoia that sets in. This kind of a story, very Night of the Living Dead. Humans trapped in a single location under supernatural forces ends up bringing out their worst aspects in a lot of ways. This is also a product of its time. I do think, from my memory of the novella, which I've not read in maybe close to 10, 15 years, it's certainly not a happy story by any means, but I think Darabont brings a lot of the anger and the bitterness up to the surface even more. And that was certainly informed at the time, that this came out during the tail end of the Bush administration. And there was a lot of discussion around fanatical evangelicalism, becoming so intertwined in the political discourse that I think Darabont is very pointedly addressing those things. There's that entire, there's that really, really cynical discussion that all the characters have where everybody's like, human beings are terrible. We're all just incredibly stupid and we're going to tear each other apart. Like, we're just going to kill each other. It's like, all right, Darabont, like, I'm not saying I disagree with you, but wow, like, I feel like we're looking at his, composition notebook from high school where he just went, real emo and was just like, everybody sucks and I hate everybody.
Nobody understands me.
Exactly. I mean, it's cynical, and that's not a good or bad thing. It's just, I think the angle that the movie's taking. And I think that when we talk about the ending eventually, that is going to be where a lot of the controversy around this movie is, because the movie pointedly makes very cynical remarks about humanity, society, religion, and then the ending feels like an even meaner punch to that kind of mission statement.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned its sort of cynical tone, because I feel like for me, I loved the movie when I first saw it. I love the monstrous ecosystem. I thought the performances were really good, and I was very satisfied. But the one thing that I didn't totally buy into was that in such a small amount of time, you could go from ordinary townspeople to zealots like irrational zealots following a mad woman in days, and I didn't buy that when I first saw it, and I definitely buy it now.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, we all lived through 2020, and well, really the last 4 years. It's interesting because Laurie Holden's character distinctly points that out. She's like, it's just been 2 days. Like, it's 2 days and already she has a congregation.
Yeah, she's like, what the hell, people?
Yeah, exactly. I think if you gave it like even a week or two, I think there would be a need. Also, I think it would just necessitate a longer adaptation of the story. You could really flesh out the descent because it's a tried and true story idea. I mean, this is Night of the Living Dead. It's people in a confined space with an outside force. It is eventually going to be a pressure cooker situation that brings out the worst in them. And we've seen that in a number of stories. And I think The Mist is honing in on a very specific kind of cynicism. And it is wrapped up with fanatical, primarily Christian religion and kind of the feelings about anti-intellectualism, the fact that William Sadler is the one who brings up, we don't have some fancy college degree and, you're from some city or something, you work in the movies and stuff. It's like, yeah, the movie's making a very, very direct criticism of those kinds of characters and those kinds of viewpoints. And it's, I think, very telling that he is one of the first to immediately become one of Mother Carmody's congregation. So it's mean. Like there's a part of me that understands people not liking this movie because it is so mean and so kind of down on a lot of humanity. And that will come into play in the ending, but there's an element of the ending when we eventually get to having to talk about that I don't think that gets brought up enough that I think can counter that argument a bit.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because these are concerns about what communities will do under pressure that are, present in The Stand. They're in a lot of Stephen King works, and he's still preoccupied with them if you follow him on Twitter.
Oh, sure.
And it's obviously, this is one of the bleaker interpretations, I would suppose, in terms of where he was at interpreting his thoughts and feelings on that subject while writing it. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's entirely hopeless to me, which is not what I'm interpreting what you're saying as, but it is so weird that it is so dark to me, because normally he at least has the forces of goodness have either some subtle advantage, as in it, or they're roughly evenly matched. They're not usually so easily overwhelmed by a totalitarian menace in a way.
Yeah, well, this is interesting because this is less you're absolutely on the money when you talk about King having a very strong sense of moralistic forces in his stories. The Mist is kind of an anomaly, I feel, at least the film adaptation. Forgive my lack of familiarity with the Vela being so long, but it's not really a good evil thing going on The Mist. It's more about practicality versus fanaticism. And you can certainly ascribe morality to those two things, but I think what makes The Mist, the film version of The Mist, a lot harder to chew on for some people is that it's very easy to say, like, well, of course, like, David Drayton is the good person and Mother Carmody is the evil one. And it's like, sure, but it's more about, I really like, and Thomas Jane's performance, I think, brings this out in a lot of moments, is that David Drayton is pretty much always the smartest man in the room in the movie. He's the one that's like, no, I'm trying to be very pragmatic and analytical about whatever the situation is, and this is how we need to approach it. And then, ideas of fanaticism and emotion end up overtaking the people in the supermarket. And so like you say, where it's like, yeah, there's usually like a sense of a force of good. This actually kind of strips that away and makes it, I think, a scarier statement. It's like, it's not good or evil. It's kind of like, and this is a very, kind of a regressive thing to say, but it is more of a kind of sane versus crazy, setup.
Right. Right, where like the you have these forces outside the house and you have the monster inside the house that's growing at the
Yep.
same time, and you have a bunch of reasonable people caught in that sort of vice.
One thing we haven't been able to dive into too much just yet is the whole government aspect of this too, because that
Yes.
just adds in this third element. You have David and Mrs. Carmody, and then you have the MPs who are stuck with them as well. And, eventually people kind of turn to them and they're looking for answers. And they're just like, we don't know what's going on. And the likelihood of them not knowing what's going on kind of seems to be a fine line, because sure, it could be something that is completely over their pay grade, over their ranking, but at the same time, they probably have a better idea than everyone else as to what could be going on. And I think King loves to make commentary about how the government acts. And I'm reading Under the Dome right now, which has a big military presence in it, at least at the point in the book that I'm in. I'm only about a fourth of the way through. But, King has always been outspoken about these things. So I like that the movie took that part and I think pretty closely followed the story in that regard. And I know the ending is different, which we will definitely have thoughts on, but I just think the way that the government is portrayed in this is something that just adds another element to the story that is already sort of terrifying in its own right.
King has always had a strong streak of anti-authoritarianism in him. And that almost always is reflected through government figures. I struggle to, off the top of my head, think of a government entity in a King story that is a total force for good. They often have their own machinations that are portrayed as sinister by King. Or if not sinister, at least foolhardy or inept or something. And that element in The Mist, it has to be there, I think, one, to explain to, I think, certain moviegoers that no, The Mist is going to have something that you can understand why it is and what it is. It's like, yeah, the scientist opened a door to another dimension. Boom. Easy enough. But I think more so, and without getting into the specifics of the ending yet, there is something I never noticed watching this movie before. If you play the credits all the way through, the last noises that you hear on the soundtrack are military helicopters and military vehicles. It's scary. It's such a clear choice to end the movie with those sounds. And it feels like another, like, well, we've just traded one swarm of monsters for another.
Yeah, because this is an interesting case. It's not like, say, Pennywise that actively chooses to engage in supernatural villainy from its own motives. This is a case of, it's like a Frankensteinian, like, sort of, the government was experimenting with things that it didn't properly understand, and it unleashed forces it can't control by sheer accident. And the things that are pouring out of, I don't remember if it was like a portal or a rip in space-time or whatever, eroded the barrier between worlds. Like, the things that are pouring out don't, as we understand, have motives. They're just being themselves.
They're animals.
And they're things that, exactly, they're animals, and they're things that shouldn't have been unleashed. And they were unleashed by the government trying to engage with forces it can't contain.
As far as we know, I mean, that's the explanation given by Sam Witwer's character. But he admits, it's like, look, this is all just stuff we heard about. Like, there's no... the fact that we don't, Stranger Things style see the Arrowhead Project and see them opening a window or anything. It's like, we don't know. Like, we never get a clear understanding of how and why this happened. Certainly from the government's position. There's an argument to be made like, hey, maybe this was a test run. Maybe they wanted to see what happened if they opened it up and these creatures got out and something. We don't know. Like, the most we get is what Sam Witwer tells us, and he openly says, like, look, I think he uses the exact term you used, Deanna, which is like, it was above our pay grade, And so it's like these were always just rumors that we heard, but it's the only explanation that we're given, so it's the one we kind of have to go with. But even then, it's that whole sequence in which this is a very, very common thing in society and psychology, in that they immediately blame Sam Witwer, and they kill him and sacrifice him and everything. And there's this idea that, well, once we find one person to put the blame on, we feel that the problem is solved, which is hardly ever the case. Problems are often, systemic. But if we find somebody that we can point the finger at and punish, we feel satisfied. And that's another moment that happens in the story. That's another kind of cynical look at how societies function.
Well, that's Carmony's entire game. Her entire game is like, oh, no, this is the wrath of God. You have angered God. For some reason, listen to me, and I know things for some reason now. And if we find the right sacrifice, we can appease the creatures and we can appease the deity.
Yeah, and it's terrifying. And certainly I think in 2007, at the end of the Bush era, that it was just too much for a lot of people. It was too bleak. It's a bleak movie. I mean, the soldiers, two of them end up committing suicide. We see another one when they go to the pharmacy who's, yelling, "I'm sorry, it's our fault," before he explodes into spiders. By the way, for anybody listening, all the creature stuff in this, if we haven't said, is great. A person explodes into spiders. That's just a flatline great thing to have in your movie. But tonally, this is all really, really, really harsh in a movie with a bunch of wackadoo spider creatures.
Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly touch on that government element there, because obviously it plays a pretty big part in the final moments of this movie. But is there anything else you two want to touch on before we dive into the ending and start wrapping this up?
I would say not. When you talk about the ending, we all know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I love the lead up in which they actually escape and they get in the car and they drive past again that wonderful Mark. I don't know if that's his particular piece of score. That might be a sourced track. But I love the music in this movie. It's very minimalist and creepy. Yeah. There's not like a theme or anything, but and the score is not super present all the time. It's very choosy about when it wants to utilize score. But that ending lead up in which they drive past and they're driving out and they have to, they drive past David's house and see his wife all webbed up, which, if I remember correctly, is the end of the novella, is that he goes back to his house, sees that it's been webbed up, and then they just drive on into the mist, and that's it. Like, we don't know what happens. Anybody listening, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's how the novella ends. But then it goes on. And the moment of the movie that I remember getting chills towards the ending is when the giant Leviathan creature shows up.
Mm-hmm. It's my favorite part. Every single time I get chills.
And they set it up very nicely early when there is a large creature that's outside the store that we never see till we only see its silhouette, and has a big crab claw. It kills Ollie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's called online. It's called the arachnolobster.
Okay, I'll buy that for $1.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
And Drew, real quick, the ending there is they go to David's house, but the roads to it are to the point where they can't get to the house. And then on the radio, they hear about Hartford, and it kind of ends with them just driving on, and there's no real definite ending. But this is so bleak. And, I had told some friends I was going to be watching it, and they were like, oh my goodness, that ending. It was the first thing they mentioned without spoiling it.
It's such a bold choice for anybody not listening. I really hope if you're listening at this point, the ending that we're talking about, in which David decides to kill everyone in the car that has survived except himself, including his young son, because they believe that, they've run out of gas and they hear the monsters coming. It is such a bold choice that I totally understand why it eclipses the entire conversation around this movie. It's so cruel. Thomas Jane, to his credit, plays it almost too well.
Well, and it's so interesting, too, because it's one of the few... I mean, Stephen King is notoriously opinionated about his adaptations, as he has every single right to be. And, famously, he has strong disagreements with The Shining and its interpretation. But this is one of the cases where he actually prefers the film's ending.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's an author who has often come under criticism specifically for his endings. That there's a lot of criticism from people saying he doesn't know how to write an ending. The Mist is, whether you like it or not, it's an ending, and it's a powerful one, to the point that, like I say, I think it's almost too powerful, where it is the only thing that people, walk out of the theater or walk out of a screening of, and that's what is left with you. However, and this is a viewpoint that I've only begun to hold in recent years, I think that the ending of the movie, while it is exceptionally bleak and cruel, is actually a message against hopelessness. I mean, of course it's a very cruel message, being that, okay, he succumbs to hopelessness, and if he'd just waited, 5 more minutes, they would have been saved. But the most important part of the ending to me is that Melissa McBride's character shows back up at the end.
Yes.
Yep.
That is the thing that at the beginning of this whole endeavor, when the Mist showed up and she said, I have to go out and get my kids, won't somebody come and help me? That was a moment of everybody, including our hero, denied her, that they went a selfish route.
She's left for dead, effectively. Her and, by implication, her children.
Yes, and it's not a simple matter of like, well, if they would have gone with her, everything would have been hunky-dory. The fact that she shows up at the end with her children...
Just fine. Everyone's fine.
If she wasn't there, if it was just she went out into the mist and we never saw her again, and her ending was left unclear, and the ending played out as it did, it would be the most hideous ending to me. But the fact that she does show up and she looks directly at him, and David is saying, is like, they're dead for what? As he's crying and screaming. It is a call to, like, if you would have stayed on the side of hope, and this woman represented hope at the very beginning of this, then we can make it through. Like, we can make it through whatever horrible catastrophes and antagonists that are put our way in a society, if we hold on to what seems to be, when she first decides to leave, a very naive hope.
Right. And I think it's also interesting, too, because her character is, in the service of hope, very brave, right? Even by herself, she's going to walk into the abyss, and in the service of protecting her children and keeping her family together, which is a choice that, yes, he has a son to look after, but it's a choice that David's character does not make. And as a consequence, his house is, his family is gone because he didn't do that.
It is the one moment I feel of true selfishness that David expresses in the movie, and it seeds his downfall. And I think that is the crux of the ending to me, more so than the kind of twist element of it. The twist of, I mean, granted, the hearing the sounds of the monsters and David, kind of like, come on, kill me. Again, I'm being comedic in my reading of that. Thomas Jane's performance in this it's just heartbreaking. But that shot of the tank coming out of the mist, it is unavoidably mean. It's a nasty, nasty way to go about it. But then showing Melissa McBride's character it's mean with a point.
Exactly. Like in a moment of selfishness, he abandoned his wife. He didn't choose to take the same course of action. He didn't help someone trying to get home, which would have been his avenue to do the same thing.
Right.
And as a consequence, everything is lost to him. Because, I mean, like, I don't care. If this happened in real life, it's hard to say, of course, what you would do because it's unimaginable.
Right.
But, I mean, if I'm stuck at the grocery store, I'm getting home. Like, I'm not going to abandon my family. That's not the choice that someone that loves would make. And she doesn't, and she's rewarded for doing the right thing.
Exactly. Her reasons for leaving, unlike some of the other characters, it is motivated purely by love, and in a moralistic sense, it is the good thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so I understand. It's difficult for me to argue against somebody who really dislikes the ending of this movie, because I get it. Like it's an ending, and to end specifically right there and be like, all right, we're done. Goodbye.
Yeah.
That's it. It is leaving you in a place of despondency. Like, if you're in David's head.
Right, because I would say that it's not even like just the tanks show up, right? Because even that's like, well, you still might be outmatched, and it still leaves the question up in the air as to would he even be saved, right? But it actually shows an entire horde of soldiers having success against these creatures that have been impossible the entire time. So it really reinforces, like, it's not just a tank showing up. It's like, oh no, dude, you were fine.
It's a whole convoy of them. And the reason I like this ending, and I've talked about endings a lot on this podcast for obvious reasons, and it always feels to me like even though you get a maybe quote unquote happy ending in a Stephen King novel, it always comes with loss. But this one, it felt very true to a horror ending where there is triumph in the fact that the military has come and they are, defeating all of these creatures, and they did save people, even though, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily say directly that the military is sort of the hero of this story. I don't think that by any means, but there's this sort of relieving moment where that a bunch of the people have been saved. But for David, he struggled the entire time with, my wife is home alone, but I also have my son with me and I need to consider him. So his loyalty, so to speak, and his love for his family was torn because it wasn't as simple as him going by himself to get his wife. He had his son to think about too, whereas with Melissa McBride's character, it was just her, and she didn't have a choice but to go get her kids because they were young kids who admittedly probably shouldn't have been left home alone, but that's besides the point.
Yeah, her performance definitely, and her appeal definitely highlights that, there was some sort of implicit apology, if you will, that she has to get home to them no matter what, but admittedly they're very, very vulnerable, and she seems to very implicitly acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, she says it's like, the one of them, she's young, she's watching, and she forgets sometimes, and that ending shot, which the ending shot is that big crane up to seeing, the military choppers flying in, and there's a monster being, torched. That is the most chilling aspect of the ending to me today, is that it's incredibly mundane. The way that the military has taken care of this. And to me, I'm like, well, this is just another wave of monsters. Like, it's a different kind of monster. That they're the ones that allowed this to happen in the first place, and the way that they seem to be dealing with it is like, yeah, all right, just clean it up, whatever. They don't realize the fact that David is there screaming, just completely breaking apart.
They don't acknowledge him really at all.
No, and that's the thing, is that these cold military figures are in the midst of this man's absolute emotional destruction, and everything's just kind of like, yep, business as usual, sweep it up.
Yeah, and they just walk by him in the car like, whatever.
Yeah, it's that is so chilling to me, the unfeeling nature of these monolithic entities that, and that's certainly something that we get with the monsters don't express any kind of emotions other than animalistic. And then we have the military kind of, it's like they're kind of acting the same way, and then the credits roll and we just hear those choppers, and it's like, yeah, I flash back to so many moments in the movie where we're alerted to the monsters first by noises, banging on the cargo door, or the skittering of the
vibrations in the water.
Yeah, like all of that, and it's like, this is just, now I'm hearing the noises of different monsters as the movie ends. It's rough.
It is. It's kind of interesting too, because I mean, this is by implication their fault that these entities from another dimension have poured into our realm. But in seeing the military kind of so casually deal with it, it kind of underlies the implication that, well, okay, so this is not the end of their experimentation with this realm. This was a problem, But you know they're going to continue experimenting in an attempt to weaponize a thing.
Yeah, I mean, under like the immediacy of David's choice is the big gut punch, and then it doubled, it's a 1-2 punch if he makes that decision and then he could have been saved right then. But to me, the real chilling aspect of the ending that I see now all these years later is that final shot of these military choppers and trucks and everything. And it's like, man, I understand this being too dark for people. I think it's brilliant, but I get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it isn't the classic Frankenstein problem of, well, here's an obsessed scientist that just organically unleashes forces. Turns out it couldn't be controlled. If it's a military project, the purpose is weaponizing. Like weaponizing the Todash darkness.
I think to your point about, with the Frankenstein thing, you can, again, point the blame at like, well, it was Dr. Frankenstein. He's the one that's doing the experiments. He's the reason that the problem. The scarier thing is like, it's not one person. It's an entity, a massively powerful entity. In this case,
a bureaucratic choice.
Yeah, it's this military that, I mean, in a scary way, it's like we've seen these monsters destroy these people throughout the movie, but then the military can easily take care of them. That's scary. Like that amount of power, they have more power than these monsters. That's scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought this was really, really well done, though, even though, I personally do not need the adaptations to be strictly following the source material. You have some directors who will do that. Mick Garris, in particular, is known for sticking pretty close to the source material, but with a story like this, there are so many different ways you can go that I'd like that they did play around with the ending and it wasn't just this sort of open-ended ending.
Mm-hmm. I can see the value in the novella's ending and the movie's ending.
Yeah.
I understand them. They're different choices because I think they have different goals. It is very clear to me in adaptation that Darabont, whatever commentary and angry commentary was in the source material, Darabont just dragged all that up to the surface and then piled more on top of it. So in that sense, while this is a fairly faithful adaptation of the novella as far as the skeleton of it and everything, I think tonally it's its own beast.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, in effect, it's like, oh, you want cynicism? I'll give you cynicism.
Yeah,
like I'll give you these like sinister forces of human civilization laid bare.
And I certainly think in relation to the other King adaptations he's done that have been very popular, such as Shawshank and Green Mile, those mostly end on hopeful notes or a sense of good triumphing in the world. So when he does the other side of the coin and decides to do something negative or dark or critical, it's as powerful as if he was doing something good and uplifting. But it's on the opposite side of things. It's going to be very crushing. I like The Mist a lot. I think upon this watch, and maybe because I watched the color version, it is a movie where I can see the flaws that people see for the first time really well. But I think that so many aspects of it are working so well, in particular the cast, the creature design, the handle-on tone. For as dark as there are moments of humor in this movie, people. There are funny moments, even though even some of them are dark, as when Ollie kills Mrs. Carmody. He's like, I wouldn't have shot her if there wasn't any other way. And David's like, that's why I said thank you, Ollie.
Yeah, because she wants to sacrifice David's son, Billy, So it's like, do you shoot her or let her kill a kid who ends up dead anyway? So then there's that whole situation.
There are very fleeting moments of levity in the movie.
Yes.
And most of them involve Carmody getting attacked.
Sure.
They're always played in a comedic way.
Yes, when she gets slapped,
mm-hmm.
that I can see getting a big cheer from an audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a very, very well executed adaptation. I think it's a very good creature movie, but I am now, having watched it again in full for the first time in a while, I'm kind of resigning myself to people who dislike the movie particularly because of its bleakness. Because I'm like, you know what? I get it. I understand. Like, it is. Let me ask you this, Deanna, having been the person that's headlining this project and singing this. Would you say this is the bleakest Stephen King film adaptation you've seen?
I think so. So far, anyway.
That speaks for something, and there is an understanding that can be too bleak for some people.
Yeah, I get that. I think that, well, there's an adaptation coming up of Revival that, if it sticks to the source material, is at least as bleak.
Mm-hmm.
And I look forward to that. The thing for me that I think makes the bleakness fine is that it sticks well with the sort of tone of a proper cosmic horror style story, because
it manages it exceptionally well. Like I
right.
believe that. I can see people not seeing that and being, the bleakness is just so overpowering that they can't pierce through it. But I agree.
And it may not be your speed, like
right.
you may not enjoy things like that. And I accept that. That's fine. Where it works for me personally is that, obviously in a proper cosmic horror style story, you have protagonists who are engaged with forces that are so outside the realm of experience that resistance against them is nearly futile, and there's almost no chance of them, even fully comprehending it, right? And so that's literally what happens to the protagonists.
It's about the incredible overpowering effect of dread. Like, that's what a lot of cosmic horror really draws upon, is that there are forces in this universe that are so beyond you and that absolutely overshadow you in, not just size, but in concept, in thought, in form.
That the best you can hope for is that they find you irrelevant.
Yes, exactly. That is the best case scenario.
It's like it's not cosmic horror, but in the scene in Godzilla King of the Monsters where the military is attacking Godzilla and things are exploding and it doesn't even bother to look. No, that's cosmic horror.
Exactly.
In that one moment.
There's this thing that regards you as we would regard an ant.
Precisely.
So when you stack that on top of the cynical social commentary that's going on, it's this is like a triple-decker bleakness sandwich. So So again, I get it, but I think the movie is in total control of that tonally.
I would agree with you. I feel like it manages that balance. But it is so interesting to me how it's like, yes, okay, so in the scheme of the universe is not as we know it to be, and in the face of these forces, who knows what else is out there, we're pretty much nothing. But also, to our institutions, they're the reason why we even had to deal with this in the first place, and we don't really matter to them. They just go about their day.
Exactly. Yeah.
You can't trust your neighbors, because when forced with the crisis, your neighbors are going to start a cult and try and sacrifice your kid. And if you had just went home and loved your freaking wife, like, maybe she'd be alive.
You would have been okay. Yeah, I do think this is a standout in Stephen King's filmography, but I think it is always going to be a controversial one. But in a way, that helps make it, even more remarkable.
And it's completely understandable. And Drew, I like to do some ratings here as we wrap up. And, I gave this a 4 out of 5 because even though I have not seen the black and white version, which maybe I'd like it a little more even watching that version instead of the color version, I thought it was very well done. And I look at all of these movies in the context of the time period, the budget, because you can't necessarily compare a movie like this to something like the new It movie, which had a higher budget. Chapter 2 especially had an even higher budget than the first one. But I think with the way technology was then, they did what they could as far as the CGI goes. And like I said earlier, it doesn't look terrible. It doesn't make me want to turn it off. And that's always a plus because, Drew, you and I have watched movies where we're like, why did we do this?
Yes. No, I mean, as far as ratings, I give this a 4 out of 5 also. I think I think that in past years I would have given it kind of 5 out of 5. The only reason it drops down for me is that there's a couple things that we didn't touch on. I do think even though it is a little over 2 hours, there's maybe about 5 minutes of this movie that you could chop off. And some of that is even, it could take away from, like, we didn't mention there is a character who I don't even know if she gets named. She's one of the women that is taking care of Billy, who commits suicide.
Yeah.
And it's like, geez. it's
I mean, Melissa McBride's character doesn't even have a name, so I think
Right.
a few people went nameless throughout this, and I
Sure.
think that's okay though, given the kind of context that this is in.
No, I don't think that's a negative. It is more like that character committing suicide. Again, that's a moment where I'm like, that feels bleak because you really want to hammer home how bleak this situation is.
Right.
Right, that there isn't really like that is the plot function of the character.
Right. Yeah, I don't know her name. I don't know her
It's just
function
stacked
outside
tragedy.
of that. Like, she's going to kill herself to remind us, like, man, shit sucks, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, and they're not dealing with that well. Just in case you were a little confused.
Yeah. So I think there's little bits and pieces. There's also some of the scenes in which are basically characters sitting around talking about what they're going to do in the next scene. Those aren't by design bad, but I think there's ways to trim those up or to have, in writing parlance, kind of shooting the computer, in which, particularly for you, Deanna, for a Lost reference, in which if you need to get information or you need to get your characters explaining exposition or where the plot needs to go, you can give them an action that can propel that forward. So, because there's a lot of this movie are just like, all right, there's going to be 4 or 5 people kind of standing around talking about what they're going to do in the next scene.
Yeah.
And then the next scene happens, monster things happen. All right, let's come back. Let's have another scene where 4 or 5 people stand around and talk about, all right, what are we going to do in the next scene? Again, it functions. I think it helps. I think that's a factor that helps the pacing. But I do think that there would have been ways to kind of tighten that up a little bit.
Well, yeah, you can always show those. You can almost always show those elements and motives and stuff in far more subtle ways.
Yeah, if not subtle, just propulsive. Like the movie is. I will say that the movie is a very good example of high peaks, low valleys in terms of action. That when monster stuff's happening, man, it's happening. It's crazy, and you're getting assaulted by wonderful creature design and horrific moments. I mean, like, again, to double down the bleakness, like there's that poor guy that burns himself trying to fight the monsters, and then they have to, you know, they're going to go to the pharmacy to get him burn medicine, and he dies anyways. It's like, whoo, wow.
There's a man who gets eaten and is in half, you know?
Yeah, it's just like, man, like, I get it, but you could pull back a little bit, Frank. Like, just a little. I'm not asking for a lot.
Yeah. Jeff, what did you ultimately end up rating this?
I would give it ultimately about a 4.5 out of 5, and
Okay.
we're allowed to do half.
Yep.
Oh, sure.
Because I don't think everything at 100% lands for me. I think there are some small pacing issues. I feel like I love the Carmody performance in general, but there are some scenes where she's chewing the scenery so much. Like, it's just like it's the type of thing that in a miniseries you would have stretched out over 8 episodes and then you'd believe it, but it goes to 12 out of 10 in a second. That it doesn't always land for me as well as I'd like it to. But I also feel like if you take this as a sort of cosmic horror-esque story about how small we are in the scheme of things and how our institutions, we're small in the face of our institutions as well, which are at least as menacing. Like, those are interesting topics to explore, and I think it does a good job with some really solid creature designs backing it up.
Yeah, definitely. Well, guys, we've had quite the discussion here, so I want to thank you both for joining me today. And to anyone who maybe listened to this whole episode and has not seen the movie, even though we spoil everything, I still think it is one of the Stephen King adaptations worth watching. And I mean, if you read the stories before you watch the adaptations too, you have a very good idea of what is supposed to happen, really. But, you know, this one takes it and tweaks it. But again, thank you both for joining me. Jeff, this is your first episode, though, so do you have anything you want to plug before we go here? And Drew, you will have your turn to plug some stuff as well.
First of all, thanks again for having me on. It was great talking with the both of you, and I love The Mist, so it was very exciting. You can find me on Twitter, and I post most of my writings at REEL Jeff Ewing. And also check out my podcast, Humanoids from the Deep Dive, where we talk about your favorite monsters and monster movies. Last episode, we talked about Jinn with the Wishmaster series, and our next episode, we'll be talking about biblically accurate angels, which are a complete trip.
Oh, are you guys going to talk about like Noah?
We actually touch on Noah a little bit, but I was kind of saving some of the Watchers and the deeper mythos for their own thing.
Yeah, because that is weird.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit because it's interesting.
Yeah, Drew, hit us with your plugs.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was a great episode. I mean, normally when it's me and Deanna, we have to watch stuff like Mangler 2. So I was very happy to come on here and be here for your inaugural episode, Jeff. This was a great conversation. Y'all can check me out on Twitter at Drew Dietsch, and go to genrevision.com for all of my wonderful podcasting fun. But yeah, as always, it's a absolute blast doing these episodes with you, Deanna.
Same to both of you.
Thanks so much.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.